Well, good morning, everyone. I'm glad that you're here. If you're watching online, we're thankful for that as well. We're starting a new series called Silence. When I was growing up, we would often go camping for weeks at a time. One time we actually went for 4 weeks, and we went all the way to California and back. And you know, when you're in the car with, there's 6 of us kids, my parents, and I remembered this morning as I was thinking about this, we always took our dog along with us as well. He loved ice cream cones. But we would play games like find a state's license plate, right? Did anybody else ever find that? I actually won that game from 1975 a few years ago because I found Hawaii. None of us found it on that whole trip. I was the only one still playing though. But there was another game that my parents loved to play. Any idea what it was? The Quiet Game. Oh my. We like quiet, don't we? But we don't like silence. I have a friend that when he texts me, if I don't respond right away, guess what happens? He texts me again. And again, and again. One time I counted them up, within a 10-minute period of time, he texted me 8 times. Or have you ever been on the phone and you're talking to somebody and all of a sudden, hello, are you still there? Are you there? We don't like silence. And we especially don't like it when God is silent, when we have been calling out to Him, crying out for help, and it seems as if He doesn't respond. Sometimes it's delayed, as it is in the story that we are going to look at and read today. But here's a key principle that we need to remember. God's silence is how it feels, not how it is. Is that the right PowerPoint? There we go. So remember that. God's silence is how it feels, but it isn't how it is. He listens to us. He hears us. And He's at work even when it doesn't seem that He has heard us. In John chapter 11, we have the story of Lazarus. Beginning at verse 1, now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped His feet with her hair. So the sister sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. When He heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when He heard that Lazarus was sick, He stayed where He was 2 more days. This is Jesus. Jesus didn't even really need to go to where Lazarus was, did He? On other occasions, people would come to Him and say, hey, I'm not worthy to have you in my house. And He would say, go. And at that very hour, the person who was sick would be made well. So he could have just right there and then, when He heard that Lazarus was sick, He could have done something about it, but He didn't. He stayed, it says in the text, for 2 more days. Then He said to His disciple, let's go back to Judea. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you are going back there? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light. After he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So when he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, I'm glad I was not there. That sounds kind of cruel, doesn't it? He's dead, and I'm glad I wasn't there. For your sake. Well, God, what in the world how could this possibly be good? So that you may believe, but let us go to him. Then Thomas said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said, if you had been here. Have you ever said that to God? If you'd been here, you know, if you had been here, I could have resisted that temptation. I could have been strong if you would have been with me, Lord. Or, you know, if you had been here, I would have been spared this sorrow, this pain, this hurt. We say that to God sometimes, don't we? Man, if you'd been here, things would have been different. I would have got that raise at my job. I would have got that promotion. I'd get along with my neighbor. Whatever it might be, sometimes we put the blame on God, don't we? Well, if you had been here, it wouldn't have been this way. Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Our belief is so important. Do we believe that God hears us even when it doesn't feel like he hears us? Do we believe that, you know, God is speaking right now, isn't he? He is not silent, but it feels like he's silent. You know, sometimes he speaks and we don't listen. Aren't we a lot like toddlers? You know, God said, well, I didn't hear that. At other times, I've listened, but I'm not going to respond. You know, because I didn't like that. For a number of years, I fought the call to preach. I knew I was supposed to preach, but I didn't want to preach because preaching's not an easy thing. And not only is it not an easy thing, it's a burden if you're doing it the way you should. I mean, it's kind of scary that I will have to give an account not only for how I lived, but how and what I've taught you guys, and how I've been in the Word and of the Word. And so, you know, sometimes we listen and hear him, but we don't respond. And there are other times when we're just not ready at all to hear something that he says to us. Would you agree with that? There are times, no, I'm not ready for that at this moment. And Martha's got great faith for the future, but not for the moment. She believes that down the road, but not right now. She's in a state of grief and sorrow. Verse 27 says, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. It's always good to be in God's presence, isn't it? But imagine him asking us to come join him. That's special, isn't it? Martha had been out there and she talked to him, but Mary was invited by Christ himself. He was asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you'd been here," there it is again. Man, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And he says, "Where have you laid him?" "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. There's a lesson in that. God will not do by divine power what we can do in our human ability. And sometimes we want him to do. You know, it's like, "God, why didn't I pass that test that I didn't study for? I prayed and asked you to help me." Well, if you would have studied. So he says to them, "Roll away the stone." Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Again, that's a great lesson, that God will not do by his divine power and ability what we can do. I think of that, you know, Jesus could have just went like this and the stone would have moved away. He could have went like this and all the linen would have, but he had them. There's always my part and his part. And my part when it comes to his silence is to listen. I'm afraid that in our day and age, that sometimes his voice is drowned out by all the noise that we have. There is so much bombarding us that we can't even hear his voice because we won't be quiet long enough. Like my friend, he doesn't give me a chance to text him back. So silence is how it feels to us, but it's not how it is. What should we do? Well, let me suggest a few things that we can do. Number one, confront known sin. Sometimes it's something on our end that prevents us from hearing what God is saying to us. We know we shouldn't have, but we did anyway. Have you ever done that? There's been times in my life when I know I shouldn't have, but I did anyway because it felt good or it's because I wanted to do. We are sinful by nature. Psalm 139 verses 23 and 24 say, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you, and lead me along the path of everlasting life." When you go to the doctor, I don't know how you are. I know how I am. I don't walk into the doctor and I don't say to him, "Well, here's the diagnosis I came up with. This is what's wrong. Here's what you need to do." But we approach God that way sometimes, don't we?
Yeah.
Instead of allowing Him to search us and reveal to us what needs to be changed, we say, well, here, God, you need to change, and you need to accept this. You need to allow this. This needs to be okay. So confront any known sin, because it is a buffer that will keep us from being able to hear God's voice. Secondly, we need to reflect and remember. I think every one of us in here could tell of a time when we were praying and it didn't seem like God was speaking or answering or didn't hear us, and later on, the answer came through. Right? We need to remember those times. We need to reflect on what He's done in our lives. We need to go to the Old Testament of this book and look at how God was faithful to His people. Not for a day, not for a week, but for years and centuries. Faithful to the point that Jesus, who was promised long ago, finally came to the earth. And we need to reflect and remember that one day He's returning, isn't He? Doesn't seem like it today. It seems like things are getting worse. So we need to confront any known sin. We need to reflect and remember all that God has done for us in the past, all that God has done for others and in the lives of others. And then we need to choose sides. Joshua 24:15 says, "But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your forefathers served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." Are we going to choose to believe what God says in His Word? Are we going to believe? Are we going to choose to trust Him rather than trusting the world? Another version of that was the NIV. The CEV says, "My family and I are going to worship and obey the Lord." We're going to worship and obey the Lord. We can serve ourselves in the world, or we can serve God and trust Him. Jesus said it this way: "No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other." We can't live with one foot in the world and one foot in heaven. We cannot do it. We have to choose, which side am I on? Who am I going to follow? Who am I going to serve? So confront known sin, reflect and remember, and choose sides. I hope you choose to serve Jesus, to serve His kingdom. God is speaking. Are we listening? 2 times in this passage, Jesus says something that's very important. In verse 4, He says, "When He heard this, Jesus said, 'This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory.'" And again, in verse 40, He says, "Then Jesus said, 'Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?'" That's what it's all about, isn't it? Not my peace, not my comfort, not what I want, but what will bring God the greatest amount of glory. What will put the spotlight on Him instead of on us. Are you listening to what God is saying in your life? Or are you ignoring it? Are you giving an opportunity for Him to speak by being quiet? Or are you so busy and noisy that He can't get through to you? God's silence is how it feels, but it's not how it is. Let's pray.